A shepherd died screaming in a mountain pass on the morning of July 16, 1212, and with him died the Reconquista. His name was Martin Halaya, and the Almohad scouts, who caught him on the goat tracks above Despeñaperros, killed him before he could deliver the Christian coalition through the Sierra Morena. By nightfall, the army of Alfonso VIII of Castile lay broken on the plain below, and the long Christian recovery of Iberia ended where it had begun, in the rocks of southern Spain. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. For 17 years, Alfonso VIII had carried the memory of Alarcos. In 1195, on a hot July day, the Almohads under Abu Yusuf Yaqub al-Mansur had shattered the Castilian field army and emptied the treasury of the kingdom. The frontier collapsed back toward Toledo. The Order of Calatrava lost its mother house, and the king, then 30 years old, retreated to rebuild what had been lost. He spent the next 2 decades cultivating alliances with León, Navarre, and Aragon, marrying his daughters into the courts of Europe, and waiting. Pope Innocent III gave him his moment. In 1212, the Pope preached a new crusade against the Almohad Caliphate, and knights came down through the Pyrenees, from Languedoc, from Poitou, from as far as the Rhineland. Pedro II of Aragon brought his Catalan host. Sancho VII of Navarre arrived late, as kings of Navarre often did. By June, the army gathered at Toledo under the eye of Archbishop Rodrigo Jiménez de Rada, who would later write what he saw. The Almohad Caliph Mohammed al-Nasir, called Miramamolin in the Castilian chronicles, marched north from Seville with an army drawn from across the Maghrib. Berbers from the Atlas, Andalusians from the cities, Arab cavalry from Ifriqiya. He set his tent on the Mesa del Rey, ringed by chained slave warriors, sworn to die where they stood. What no one in the Christian camp understood yet was that a single shepherd, and the route only he knew, held the war in his hands. The Christian army reached the Sierra Morena in mid-July and found the southern road closed. The Almohad position commanded every approach. To assault uphill against archers and the chained guard meant annihilation. To retreat meant the end of the crusade, with armies dispersing back across the Pyrenees and the campaigning season lost. Alfonso called his council together in the heat. It was then that the shepherd appeared. In the histories that survive, Martin Halaya is barely a figure at all, almost a folk memory. He knew the goat paths through the Despeñaperros Gorge, the hidden ways above the main road, the high ground that would set a Christian column on the Almohad flank. Alfonso believed him. The plan was set for the night march of July 15th, but the Almohad scouts had been watching the passes for days. Mohammed al-Nasir had ordered them out the moment the Christian army arrived, because he too understood mountains, and he understood that no defender of a single road survives without watching the trails above it. The scouts found the column near dawn. They cut down the shepherd guides. They blocked the narrow places with archers. And the Christian advance, strung out in single file across broken ground, came apart against arrows it could not answer. By mid-morning, the coalition was retreating in disorder onto the open plain. Mohammed al-Nasir released his cavalry. Pedro II of Aragon fell in the rout. Alfonso VIII, wounded, was carried from the field by a handful of household knights. Sancho VII, arriving from the north with the Navarrese rearguard, found smoke and bodies and turned for home. The killing went on into evening. The Almohad pursuit was deliberate and patient. Calatrava la Nueva fell within weeks, its garrison executed, its archives burned. The frontier towns of La Mancha opened their gates without resistance. By the autumn of 1213, Mohammed al-Nasir's vanguard stood before Toledo, the old Visigothic capital, the city of the cathedral school. The siege lasted into the next spring. Alfonso VIII, still recovering from his wounds, died inside the walls in October 1214. His widow Eleanor of England negotiated terms within weeks. Toledo surrendered in November. Its Christian and Jewish communities granted protection under dhimmi status, its Mozarabic churches preserved. The Tagus became the new frontier. Mohammed al-Nasir himself did not live to see his gains consolidated. He died at Marrakesh in the summer of 1215, exhausted by the campaign, and the caliphate passed to his young son, Yusuf II. What saved the Almohad project was not the boy, but the men around him. Andalusian administrators trained in the chanceries of Seville and Cordoba took over the new northern provinces. Abu Yahya ibn Abi Hafs, the governor of Seville, ruled the frontier as something close to a viceroy. The Almohad state, which had ruled North Africa as a religious mission, began in the north to govern as a working empire. What the Reconquista had pressed upon al-Andalus for a century was the threat of disappearance. Removed from it, the cities exhaled. Cordoba, which had been a provincial center under the Almohads, became again what it had been under the Umayyads, a place where books were copied, where philosophy was taught in the open, where men argued. The works of Averroes, who had died in 1198 under a cloud of suspicion, were retrieved from the houses where his students had hidden them. By the 1240s, his commentaries on Aristotle were read in the madrasas of Cordoba and Seville, not as a defense against accusation, but as part of the standard curriculum. The migration ran south. Jewish scholars from Toledo, finding the Almohad governors less hostile than the Almohad clerics of 2 generations earlier had been, moved their workshops and their libraries. Christian translators from the cathedral school followed in smaller numbers. Latin and Arabic and Hebrew worked side by side in Cordoba, in a way they had once done in Toledo. The intellectual gravity of the Western Mediterranean settled in al-Andalus, and the universities of Paris and Bologna, deprived of the Toledan translations they had depended on, turned inward toward their own scholastic traditions. The conversation between Christendom and the Islamic world did not end, it moved. What remained of Christian Iberia was a strip of mountain and meseta from Galicia to the Pyrenees. Castile, reduced to its old heartland north of the Duero, fought León over inheritance claims that no one outside the peninsula remembered. Navarre, squeezed between Aragon and the growing power of France, gradually drifted into the French dynastic orbit. The military orders, deprived of frontier, became simply landowners, then quarreling nobles, then memories. Aragon made the most interesting choice. Pedro II had died at Las Navas, and his successors looked east rather than south. Catalan fleets fought for Sicily in the 1280s as they had in our timeline, but with more resources and less distraction. Sardinia followed. By the 14th century, the Crown of Aragon ruled an arc of Mediterranean possessions and saw itself as an Italian power rather than an Iberian one. The Reconquista, as an idea, faded from the chronicles. Children in Burgos in 1350 had never heard the word. The Almohad Caliphate, as a religious project, did not survive its 2nd century. Berber reformism, which had carried Ibn Tumart's followers out of the Atlas in 1121, could not govern the cities indefinitely. A succession crisis in 1287 between 2 grandsons of Yusuf II ended in a quiet compromise. The center of power moved formally from Marrakesh to Cordoba. The caliphal title was abandoned. What remained was a sultanate, Andalusian in its language and bureaucracy, Maghribi in its army, and increasingly Atlantic in its commerce. Seville's merchants had long traded with the ports of Morocco. By the late 13th century, they were sending ships to the Canaries, which they reached and named in their own language before any Castilian or Portuguese vessel arrived. Andalusian shipwrights, working in the yards along the Guadalquivir, combined the Latin rig of the Mediterranean with square sails copied from Genoese and Pisan visitors. The result was a vessel capable of working both winds. Generations before the Portuguese in our timeline would have arrived at the same compromise. The crews who sailed them were Andalusian Muslims, Jewish converts, North African Berbers, and a scattering of Castilian and Portuguese exiles who had taken service in the south. The push down the African coast began in the early 14th century and proceeded in stages. Cape Bojador was rounded by an Andalusian captain in 1361. More than 70 years before the Portuguese Gil Ains did so in our timeline, the trade in gold and slaves from the Senegal coast flowed back to Seville and from there into the broader Mediterranean. Jewish cartographers from the schools of Cordoba, drawing on Arabic geographical traditions and on Catalan Porto land charts, produced maps that were the best in the world. They were also closely guarded. In 1478, a Cordoban navigator named Ibn Majid the Younger, sailing under the patronage of the Sultan of Seville, was driven westward by a storm and sighted land. He spent 6 weeks among islands he took to be outliers of an Atlantic archipelago already known in fragments to the cartographers. He charted what he could, traded for water, and returned. The maps he brought back were filed in the Sultan's library. They were not published. The Sultan's advisors saw no reason to advertise a discovery that promised, at best, a long and expensive set of voyages to an unprofitable shore. The Antilles waited, and then came the moment that would define everything that followed. Sustained contact with the Americas began around 1520, but it began as a competition rather than a conquest. Andalusian merchants, French Norman captains, Portuguese factors operating out of Lagos, and a handful of Genoese investors all reached the Caribbean within a span of 15 years. No single crown stood behind the enterprise. The Sultanate of Cordoba was wealthy but cautious. Portugal never absorbed into a larger Iberian crown because no such crown existed, focused on its African and Indian trades. France, which had no Reconquista to define it and no Italian wars to drain it on the scale of our timeline, looked west earlier and with more sustained interest. The silver of the Andes, when it finally began to flow in the 1560s, did not pass through a single Casa de Contratación in Seville. It passed through Bordeaux, through Lisbon, through Cadiz, through Antwerp, through smaller ports along the Bay of Biscay. The European economy that resulted was more diffuse and slower to industrialize, but also less concentrated in the hands of a single dynasty. The encomienda system, which in our timeline shaped colonial society for 3 centuries, was never coherently established because no single power held the territory long enough to impose it. Indigenous polities along the coasts traded and resisted and adapted in conditions that did not resemble the catastrophe of our history, though they too suffered terribly from disease, which respected no political boundary. It is tempting, looking back from any timeline, to draw a clean line between the worlds that were and the worlds that might have been. The line is never clean. A shepherd lived or died on a mountain path, and from that small fact ran consequences that touched every coast of an ocean he never saw. The men who killed him on July 16, 1212, did not know what they had prevented, and neither did the king whose army they broke that afternoon. They knew only that the road was held and the enemy was below them, and that the long heat of an Andalusian summer was beginning to lift toward evening.